Vanishing Point, a novel by Keith A. Kenel. 6 of 101. Part 6. Miss Shannon valued neat, quiet lines, and she employed a robust use of peer pressure in achieving this end. "All right, class, we can line up for lunch just as soon as we're quiet," she announced daily from the front of the room. Pasco County, Florida was booming with construction, and Interlochen had been built with 3 third-grade classes. There was covert competition between Ms. Yule's, Mrs. Henniger's, and Miss Shannon's rooms to be the first in group to head down to the cafeteria, with the gold medal winner procuring bragging rights that were used to taunt the silver and bronze classes out on the playground. With rumbling stomachs and a desire to beat the other classes to the cafeteria, some of the children would start shushing one another as soon as they heard Miss Shannon's call for quiet. This peer kvetching only extended the class's time interval in purgatory, that space where they were not permitted to flee the controlled environment of the classroom and ascend to the comparative heaven that was lunchtime and recess. And yet, the loud calls for quiet persisted. Schuyler, who was notorious for being one of the last to be granted line access, was also a true and vociferous believer in the power of shushing others. An informed bookie would no doubt lay long odds that Miss Shannon's most recent pupil would be a major player in ensuring that the 2 other third-grade classes would be on their way to lunch before everyone in Miss Shannon's room was standing quietly in line. Sarah, after months of observing the inefficaciousness of shushing, had decided that repeatedly saying "shh, shh" was contraindicated. She would have gladly told her friend to stop doing it, but she realized that this would do nothing but add more hubbub to the oral brouhaha that swirled around the room. Displaying taxing constraint, the girl merely closed her eyes, flared her nostrils, inhaled, and waited in silent, though inwardly agitated, self-control. The lunch line consisted of 3 lines that were segregated by the needs of the students. The first part of the line was dedicated to the most self-sufficient third graders, those who packed a lunch that included a drink. These paradigms of preparation stood at the front of the line, and once in the cafeteria were herded to the long, white, foldable lunch table that was reserved for Miss Shannon's class. Behind the totally self-contained stood the lunchbox or brown bag corps, who brought their lunch but needed to buy milk. The final and largest section of the line was reserved for students who, at the beginning of the day, had selected either main course or alternate for their hot USDA-approved midday meal. Today, unlike most days, Sarah had brought her lunch. The school provided a monthly lunch menu for each student, and both of today's selections had proven anathema to her. Typically, Sarah preferred to purchase lunch rather than undergo the ignoble and unfashionable toting of victuals to school, but once or perhaps twice a month, her mother would prepare and pack a lunch for her. In the 5 months that Schuyler had attended Interlochen, she had never wavered from purchasing the main hot lunch option. When comparative quiet had settled over the room, Miss Shannon began calling on individual students by name, and as they were called, the children stood on either the red, white, or blue tape that stretched in a line by the classroom door. The quietest and best behaved self-contained student stood at the front of the red tape. The first student who had been granted permission to stand in line but needed milk would walk to the white section of tape, and so on. The routine was regimented, inefficient, and designed to not only facilitate lunch line flow in the cafeteria, but to also demonstrate that teachers had power, and that those who conformed to their standards received rewards, while those who did not suffered consequences. Sarah's ability to mask her teeming irritability was rewarded with the girl's name was called, and she dutifully grabbed her lunchbox from her desk and took her place at the front of the white section of line. As students' names were called, the classroom became quieter, and Miss Shannon began calling out names faster and faster. Schuyler managed to earn a spot only 2/3 of the way back from the front of the blue tape, and everyone was in place before Mrs. Henniger's 3rd-grade class began their march to lunch and a quantum of freedom. From opposite sides of the hallway, Miss Shannon and Mrs. Henniger watched as Ms. Yule's class shuffled quietly toward the cafeteria. The 2 remaining teachers looked at one another, and Miss Shannon looked back to her students who, though quiet, stood in a slovenly, meandering line. She turned her head back to Mrs. Henniger and said, "Nope, Louise, we're not quite ready. Please go ahead." Mrs. Henniger smiled at Miss Shannon and said, "Well, Stacy, maybe next time," and motioned her class to follow as she led them to the cafeteria. Miss Shannon's and Mrs. Henniger's short exchange elicited a muted moan from the students in her class, which had caused Miss Shannon, in fists on hips stance, to turn to her class and ask, "Would you like to sit down and start again?" After a pause, she added, "I didn't think so. Now quietly and in a straight line. You may go, Rachel," she said, touching the girl on the shoulder.